Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Marc Katz is my guest today. He is the rabbi at Temple Ner Tamid in Bloomfield, New Jersey, where he has introduced many initiatives, including expanding Israel discourse, enriching adult education, reimagining parent engagement in religious school, pursuing social justice, and so much more. When he's not at Temple Ner Tamid, Rabbi Katz is an adjunct professor of Talmud at Hebrew Union College, HUC, as well as a judge for the National Jewish Book Awards. He is the author of The Heart of Loneliness, How Jewish Wisdom Can Help You Cope and Find Comfort, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. His most recent book, which we'll talk about today, is called Yochanan's Gamble, Judaism's Pragmatic Approach to Life. It was published in December 2024. Welcome to the broadcast, Rabbi Katz.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So the book is Yochanan's Gamble, and if anyone is not caught up to speed on Yochanan ben Zakkai, I don't know how that's possible, because he's iconic and a linchpin in the future of Judaism, right? Post-temple destruction. Help us, give us the on one foot narrative of Yochanan.
Yes.
Or explaining the title.
So Yochanan ben Zakkai is the father of Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is the Judaism that existed after the temple was destroyed up through the next few centuries.
You mean 70?
Yes, 70 CE. And after, while the temple is about to be destroyed, the Romans are sieging Jerusalem, there's a story that goes that he sneaks out of Jerusalem and ends up having an audience with Vespasian, who is the governor of Judea at the time. And as he's talking to Vespasian, he makes...
Vespasian is the bad guy, essentially, in the tale.
Essentially,
no?
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't he oppressing Jews or running Jews out?
Yes, he is about to destroy Jerusalem. He's about to kill a lot of people. And so he ends up with an audience with this guy. And while he's talking to him, he makes this statement that says, Vespasian, one day you're going to be the emperor. And Vespasian can't believe him, but this is the founding myth of Rabbinic Judaism. So no sooner does he say that than some guy runs in and says, Vespasian, guess what? The emperor is dead. You're now the Caesar. Go to Rome and claim your spot. And
so essentially Yochanan's prophecy came true.
Exactly. And on Vespasian's way out the door, he looks at Yochanan and says, I have to imagine that your words had something to do with this. So basically ask me for anything and I'll give it to you. And Yochanan pauses and says, okay, save these two rabbis from Jerusalem that you're currently besieging, and give me a little plot of land in a place called Yavne so that after you destroy the temple, I can restart Judaism. And by the way, he does that. And
that means like a seminary, a school. What does he mean restart Judaism? Just another, it's not another temple.
Yeah, it's a place for him and his students to basically get creative, to replace, for example, sacrifice with prayer, to reimagine the holidays without Jerusalem, to figure out how marriage and divorce are going to work nowadays. And he does all of that. But there's a postscript to the story, and here's where the gamble part comes in. A rabbi whose name is Akiva says, basically, in my words, what a jerk. This guy had the emperor in front of him. He could have asked him for anything he wanted. Why didn't he ask him for the thing he really wanted, which was for Jerusalem not to be destroyed? And the Talmud, which tends to have these anonymous voices called the Stam, and the anonymous voice comes forward and says, he asked for the thing he knew he could get, not the thing he really wanted, because he might have squandered his one request had he gone for broke. And so I call the book Yochanan's Gamble because he, as the father of Rabbinic Judaism, sets off this kind of ethos, this kind of worldview or way of thinking of the rabbis that informs basically Jewish law up until today, which is this pragmatic, compromising, willing to take the incremental step, willing to get one's hands dirty approach that we honestly are pretty bad at nowadays.
And the reason why you chose to write about this now, I assume that has something to do with the fact that we are not pragmatic these days, or we're resisting pragmatism.
Indeed. So we live in a world where people stand on soapboxes, they scream at each other, they won't yield any ground. Everyone is positive they have the moral high ground. That kind of occupying the messy middle, which is what Yochanan does and what I think Jewish law is really good at, the ability to change and pivot and not accept the perfect because they understand that the perfect can be the enemy of the good. At the end of the day, that's what this world needs. You need it in your private life, you need it in your public life, we need it in the government. And Yochanan and his students provide this kind of third way from the polarization that we find in modern day discourse.
And when you're saying pragmatism, part of me reading this book, and it's very readable, beautifully written, but I want to tell people it's accessible, even though sometimes the sages can be daunting. I was kind of feeling a little bit of the discomfort of, are you saying that when we are essentially under siege, which many of us feel we are now, when there's anti-Semitism run rampant, that we kind of pivot and know how to still make our way through, even though we're not really living as fully as we might? Like, you're not talking about a pragmatism that accepts anti-Semitism, are you, or are you?
No. There are going to be times where you need to make those compromises, and there are going to be times where you don't make those compromises. And the rabbis lived in an era that's very different than ours. We have a lot more power in our world than the rabbis did. And so sometimes they made these concessions that we might feel deeply uncomfortable with. I talk in the book, for example, about the fact that at all of the different bathhouses that the rabbis used to go visit, there were big statues of Aphrodite, right? They weren't going to be able to change that. And even though they felt deeply uncomfortable with living in a world of idolatry, right? That's one of the big commandments that the Torah speaks against. They basically figure out how it is that they can still enter those bathhouses, in part because they want to keep up good relations with Romans, and because they want to be, to use Lin-Manuel Miranda's quote, in the room where it happens. And lots of business gets done in the bathhouse. And so they figured out how to make these logical jumps that people weren't actually worshiping Aphrodite, so she's not really an idol, or that the bathhouse was there before Aphrodite, so the primary reason people go is for the bath, not for Aphrodite. And they come up with a bunch of different answers. But at the end of the day, they're doing what works for them, but they also have to because they're powerless, right?
And you're also saying, and this goes to the bathhouse example, is that they're living in the real world. They're tanners, they're blacksmiths, they're working within the society they're in. They're not just kind of on high. What do you mean by the fact that they have to live in the real world and that therefore that informs their thinking?
So let me back up for a second and explain what pragmatism actually means, like what I mean by that word, right? So an optimist looks at a glass half full, a pessimist looks at a glass half empty, a pragmatist asks the question, will it quench my thirst? Right? So what is pragmatic, or what is pragmatism? It is doing the things that work. It is finding the things that have utility to them. And so for the rabbis, they lived in a world where the Romans were around, and later on in the Babylonian Talmud, the Sasanian Persians were around, and they had to basically make law conform to the world they lived in. And even when they weren't dealing with outside forces, sometimes the law caused people to get into arguments with one another. I've got a whole chapter in the book about the fact that the rabbis sometimes change law so that people don't hate each other, because a society where people hate each other, quote, wouldn't work either. Same with leaders. Leaders don't always lead so far in front of people that in fact they break their resolve. Leaders need to find a way to lead just enough in front of people that the people are following, but not too far that they lose them, because that's what works, right? And that, I would say, is the lens through which at least the rabbis are constantly looking at moral problems. They're asking the question, what will work?
And just because you raise this idea of not getting ahead of your flock, essentially, that is something that you yourself have had to think about as a rabbi with a pulpit that, is navigating through all of the strains, whether it was COVID and masking, I'm sure, the Trump election. So how do you apply the learning you did for this book to your own decision making?
So I actually, and you bring this up, I start that chapter actually by talking about COVID and how even when the government said that we could come back first masked and then later unmasked, my congregation tended to be a little bit more nervous. And so I had to weigh, how hard I was going to push them. Because at the end of the day, I wanted people back in my sanctuary. But if I pushed too hard and opened up in a way that I wanted to, people wouldn't show up. And so I had to be, and this is true for the rabbis, but it's true for every leader. I had to ultimately be a student of the psyche of the people that I was leading. Because only when I truly understood them, as much as any other text or any other law, could I effectively lead them.
So before we get into some of what's in the book, tell me how you structured it. Like when you sat down and thought, this is what I want to write about, how did you kind of divide up the idea of chapters or themes?
Yeah, so I'll take you through a tour of the book. So after beginning with Yochanan and who he was, I start then by getting into the question of, well, what exactly is truth and how does truth work? And by the way, for your readers who are hearing this, I will tell you, it's the most philosophical chapter. It's also the hardest chapter. If for some reason you're feeling lost, feel free to keep going. It gets easier. Yes. Chapter 2 deals with the power of compromise, something we're really bad at today. Chapter 3 and 4 kind of go together. They deal with how leaders should lead. Chapter 3 is not leading too far in front. Chapter 4 is how to effectively pay attention, the rabbis teach us, to the people around us so that we can gain the wisdom from the people we lead. Because as the saying goes, all of us are usually smarter than any one of us. Then chapter 5 deals with the pragmatic decisions that the rabbis had to make in dealing with the Roman world, the outside world. And chapter 6 deals with the decisions they had to make sure that people weren't infighting. Chapter 7, which is honestly my favorite chapter, deals with the tools of rabbinic innovation. Things like creatively misreading the Torah so that you can make the Torah say what it doesn't actually say in order to have grounding to make the kind of radical changes that the rabbis make. And then chapter 8, which is the most problematic chapter, deals with, it's called sinning for the greater good. And it's about the kind of hard things that people might choose to do in order to pursue some kind of greater agenda. Times, for example, where the rabbis countenance, and it makes me feel uncomfortable, murder or torture or those types of things because they see some kind of greater good. But I temper that chapter with my last chapter, which talks about the fact that although sometimes you can be what Nachmanides calls a scoundrel within the bounds of law, right? If you're too pragmatic, you can not be a good person. Judaism has these other, I would say, tempering influences on being overtly pragmatic. Things like the legal precept that you should go, quote, above the plain meaning of a law and do what's, quote, right and good in order to be the kind of person that God expects you to be, even if the law doesn't require you to do that.
I loved that section because it kind of made me think this idea of going above and beyond what's required feels like the ultimate Jewish value. Because if you just say, I met the standard, it's kind of not enough.
100%. One of the critiques that I've gotten from the book is, and I think people are fundamentally misreading what I'm saying, is that what I'm doing is I'm countenancing being pragmatic above everything. I view pragmatism not as an end, but as a tool. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think one of the most evil people in the whole of the Bible is Achashverosh, right? Maybe even more evil than Haman.
The Purim story.
The Purim story. Because in the Purim story, Haman wanted to kill all the Jews. Achashverosh wanted to stay in power. And so when Haman came to him and said, "Can I kill all the Jews?" he handed the keys over to Haman and said, "Go for it." And then at the end of the story, when Haman was vanquished and Mordecai said, "I want to kill all the people who were behind Haman," he handed the keys over to Mordecai and said, "Do whatever you want." Mordecai killed tens of thousands of people. At the end of the day, the problem with Achashverosh is that his end was his power. His end was his prestige. His end was being left alone. And he was able to use pragmatic means to get to his end. I truly believe that the end of the rabbis, right, is justice, is righteousness, is good, is building an important society, is taking care of the poor, is looking out for the widow and the orphan. It's all the things that we admire about Judaism. But they're willing to take pragmatic steps to get there. They don't need to jump to the end. They'll find, an intermediate step and embrace that because they know they don't have the political capital, for example, to get all the way to the end.
One of the things that also is surprising and maybe counterintuitive is that they're also deciding or affirming that God is not the final word.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about that? That ultimately, that would seem, again, antithetical to what they would decide, which is, isn't the divine verdict the one with the greatest weight?
Yes. So this gets into that philosophical chapter. So I'll try to summarize it as quickly as I can. The most famous story in the Talmud, I think, one that most students will encounter in their first few months of studying Talmud, is about a dispute over the kosherness of an oven. And basically, all the rabbis believe one thing, and one rabbi whose name is Rabbi Eliezer believes something else. And Eliezer calls on all kinds of miracles to prove that he's right. He asks a tree to uproot itself and replant. He makes a stream flow backwards. And all in the while, the rabbis keep saying to him, you can't prove the kosherness of an oven from a tree or from a stream. And finally, he says, well, if I'm right, let God appear. So God appears and says, Eliezer is right. And a rabbi whose name is Rabbi Yehoshua basically yells at God and tells him to butt out. First he says, God, you gave us the Torah to do with as we will do. In fact, it says in your Torah, the Torah was not created in heaven, it's ours. And you gave us a set of laws for how to do that. We should bring educated people together. We should vote. We should weigh the opinion. And the truth is, we're on one side, Eliezer's on another. The implication is, even if you're on his team, it's 2 against many, right? So we win. And there's a postscript to the story where a rabbi finds the prophet Elijah, who tends to know things about God, and says, what did God say in that moment when he got kicked out of the study hall? And the answer is, God laughed, saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Now, what is the meaning of that? Often when we think of truth, we think of, if you had an audience with God and you asked God what you should do, this is the answer, and that's the truth, right? So we want to know, for example, is it ethical to have an abortion at 16 weeks? We'll never know the answer to that, but if we were lucky enough to have an audience with God, let's say, we could go to God and we could say, God, what do you think? Is it ethical for someone to have an abortion at 16 weeks? And God would say yes or no. We can't access that. And so in the story, it's funny because actually we find that is presented as this avenue of truth. But sometimes there's greater, bigger implications for truth, let's say. And so in this particular case, a pragmatic response to truth, and pragmatism, again, is what works, is saying no to God because we can't always assume that God's going to show up. And we need to have a society that works, that runs, that allows for courts to function without intermediaries getting in the way. And so at the end of the day, what the story actually teaches us is that sometimes there are bigger things than even just asking God for an answer. And it's those pragmatic concerns that sometimes feel messy that actually lead us toward the greater avenue toward truth.
I love it when you write, like all great authors, when God put the Torah out into the world, God gave up control about how it would be read. It's also saying you humans have agency and you have to, as you say, figure out how this is going to work. Can you just address Hillel and Shammai? Because we know that they have long disputes. They are sort of the famous sparring rabbis. And I love that how you take us to why Hillel ends up kind of winning the day.
Yeah. So Hillel and Shammai disagree about everything. They disagree about how many fringes are on a tallis. They disagree about how to light the Hanukkah candles. They disagree about everything. And at a certain point, it's actually their students get so angry at one another that they need to call on God to help. And God appears, and very famously between these two schools, says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Both of the schools are the words of the living God, meaning both are true. But the problem with that is that you need to ultimately find a bottom line for law, right? Who are you going to follow, Hillel or Shammai? And so what God basically says in the moment is we're going to follow Hillel, even though Shammai is just as true, because a society works better, right? This is that pragmatic working, to have someone who is more like Hillel, who listens to the opinion of the other, who is kinder, more compassionate.
Who includes the opinion of the other.
Who includes the opinion of the other, exactly. And that actually we want a society of Hillels, not a society of Shammais. So Hillel is going to win the day.
You write, the reason Hillel wins is telling. It is not that he is smarter, sharper, or quicker than Shammai. He is chosen because he is kinder. The rabbis know that society wins when our leaders practice humility and honor.
Exactly.
I love that. Humility and honor. I'm not hearing those words a lot these days.
No.
Can you give us an example of, you were saying that part of, I guess, is it chapter 6, or when you're talking about the infighting?
Yeah.
Isn't that the reason why the temple was destroyed, as the rabbis tell it? Sinat chinam, baseless hatred. How do you address the internecine battles? And if you can put a lens for today.
Yeah. So the rabbis, first of all, understand that sometimes you have to change law that is actually causing people to fight. And that's a big part of the way that chapter 6 works, is talking about the rabbis changing law because the law doesn't work. So there's this idea in Judaism that things should be changed mipnei tikkun olam, for the sake of making the world better, or mipnei darchei shalom, for the sake of bringing about peace. And so let me talk about the bringing about peace question. And what I'm about to say is a little technical. In Judaism, ownership is done because you take something, let's say this cup, and you lift it up. And the act of actually lifting up the cup makes the cup yours, right? So imagine you've got a guy at the top of a tree beating down olives or some kind of fruit. That fruit's dropping to the ground. Technically, according to Jewish law, he doesn't own those until he gathers them up. So now imagine somebody's underneath the tree starting to gather up all the fruit underneath the tree. Technically, the fruit is owned by the person who's gathering it up, even though the one on top did all the work, right? And the rabbis understand that actually it's not working for them, because it's going to cause the guy to come down from the tree, to get mad at the other guy who's going to hide behind the law, and they're going to get into a fist fight over it. And so the rabbis have no problem realizing that actually, even though the precepts of law work a certain way, in certain circumstances, you gotta be flexible, you gotta change, you have to be willing to address the broader needs. And so they let the guy who's beating the fruit own the fruit, even though technically he shouldn't. Now, it's a very small microcosm, and the chapter's full of examples of that. But it, I think, expresses this idea that Judaism has to work in the sense that it has to bring people closer. Can I give one more example?
Sure.
It's not necessarily from this, but it's from the chapter on compromise. So the rabbis feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea of settling lawsuits, right? And the reason why is because imagine you go in front of a judge. And by the way, in the ancient world, a judge and a jury were the same. And you say to the judge, do me a favor and figure out what you think the right ruling is. What a judge's job is to get as close to God's truth as possible, right? So let's say he hears the plaintiff and the defendant, and he starts thinking about what he wants to do. And then the two people go into the back room, and either because they want to save money, or because they don't want to fight anymore, or because they don't want to clog up the court's time, they figure out some suit, like some answer to the problem, right? That isn't actually getting toward God's law. It's expedient to them. It's easy to them. It smooths things out for them. Actually, that gets you further away from truth, if that makes sense. And so what ultimately the rabbis end up deciding is they decide that settling is okay, not until the judge has basically rendered a verdict. And at that point, once he's figured out the answer, then you can't settle. But settling is okay because there are bigger things than just getting at that truth, like stopping people from fighting, like not clogging up the courts, like saving money, and all of those things.
So as we have to wrap up, I love that you list the tools at the end that the rabbis are suggesting to try to help us live with more integrity or behave with more integrity. I'm just listing some of them. Learn from everyone and everything, especially if you disagree. Weigh the received tradition. Study people as much as texts. Lead people, but not too far out in front. Seek peace. Pursue compromise whenever possible. Embrace change as a constant of life. Think unconventionally and creatively when times call for it. Take pragmatic gambles to pursue what is good. In the end, discomfort is the price we pay for taking risks. When you look at that list, what's animated mostly for you in your daily rabbinate?
So it's actually that last line, the discomfort is the price of taking risks. I end the book by talking back about Yochanan ben Zakkai. And right before he dies, he basically loses it and starts crying. And his students say to him, look, you basically saved Judaism. What are you scared about dying? And he basically says, I actually don't know whether I led a good life. And even though he doesn't bring up that gamble with Vespasian that we talked about at the beginning, it's got to be in the back of his mind, right? This is a guy who gambled away Jerusalem to do this project of restarting Judaism. And he just didn't know. And if you are this prophetic figure who stands on a soapbox and screams at one another, you're actually pretty sure that you're right. And you walk out of this world, with this sense that, I behaved with integrity, with certainty. This middle of the ground pragmatic approach means that you constantly aren't sure. Like, did I do this trade the right way? Did I make this mess the right way? Was it okay that I got my hands dirty? But the key is going to be, inaction inevitably is worse than acting with a degree of uncertainty about whether or not you were right. And I love the fact that Yochanan ben Zakkai doesn't know that he's right, because it gives us permission to make those messy gambles in our lives too, and walk forward even in the face of blindness.
Beautiful. The book is Yochanan's Gamble, Judaism's Pragmatic Approach to Life by Rabbi Marc Katz. Thank you for coming on the broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
And it's good to be with you all, and I look forward to next time. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight.